Boerne Radio 103.9 FM. Coming up at 11:30 is The Power of Perseverance with Glenn Boehm. But right now is Ceasefire with Dale Adams and Ron Cisneros. The following is sponsored by the Boerne Bookshop, and this is Boerne Radio.
Hey, Ceasefire listeners. I want to let you know about an exciting event at the Boerne Bookshop on October 12th from 1 to 3. Come meet some real Texas Rangers that will be there to share some stories with you and sign some books. We have some fun events, and Dale, I'm sure, will have some drinks or snacks to give away and some items to raffle, and we hope that you'll join us.
Yeah, we'll have all our Ranger books out.
All right.
It should be fun.
Okay, October 12th from 1 to 3.
Welcome to Ceasefire, where civics meets civility and engagement meets empowerment. Ceasefire is hosted by former Boerne ISD trustee and owner of the Boerne Bookshop, Dale Adams, and by former Boerne City Council member and local insurance agent, Ron Cisneros.
Welcome back to Ceasefire. My name is Dale Adams.
And I'm Ron Cisneros.
And today we've got an interesting subject, something you brought up a few days ago. It's all about selfishness. Is it good? Is it bad?
Virtue or a vice? And we're going to dive in and talk about it and find out.
Yeah, and we even got some philosophical background called Objectivism that we're going to talk about a little bit with Ayn Rand. It should be interesting.
I see you brought her book.
I did. It's a monster.
That is a monster. you could hurt somebody with that.
You could. I think she did.
Where do we start on this? This is a heady topic.
It is, but I want to break it down a little bit first by everybody talks about how selfishness is bad, but self-love is good, and how you have to care for yourself and take care of yourself and all that kind of stuff. And yet they're not that different. And so what I'm hoping to do is that we think of selfishness not in terms of how it feels, the word, but maybe what it really means, which is just taking care of yourself. Looking out for your own interests. Good
place to start. And with that, I want to let you start us off.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to start off with a definition then. Selfishness is a noun. It's the quality or state of being selfish, which doesn't really tell you anything. Exclusive regard for one's own interest or happiness, that supreme self-love or self-preference which leads a person to direct his purposes or her purposes to the advancement of his own interest, power, or happiness without regarding those of others. And I'm not so sure that the without regarding others is necessarily a part of selfishness, but that's the way people equate it.
You mentioned Rand, and I want to bring up a quote of hers that I think is in line with where you're going. And she said, "To love is to value. Only a rational, selfish man, a man of self-esteem, is capable of love because he is the only man capable of holding firm, consistent, uncompromising, unbetrayed value. The man who does not value himself cannot value anything or anyone." That's interesting, isn't it?
That is interesting.
I don't know that I can disagree with that.
But I don't know if I can completely agree with that, because we once, in my Toastmasters group, we talk about all kinds of stuff, and one of them was about self-love. And they asked everybody, who loves yourself, or who thinks it's important to love yourself? And I didn't raise my hand because I see love as a relational thing and not something directed to yourself. And I've already forgotten what your quote was.
Well, she was talking about love as a value, and only a man of self-esteem would be capable of loving.
Yeah, see, I when you say only, that's where I start thinking, okay, people can value things, people can love things without whatever this other tagline is that you've got going there. So I tend to disagree with pronouncements like that. Now, a lot of what she has to say, I think, is important. Her philosophy, Objectivism, is about acknowledging that the world is a real place and everything is real in it, and we fit in it as real beings. And she was definitely not in favor of any kind of spirituality, and yet some of us feel that there is a spiritual side to life that's different from the real side. And her point was that there's not, that doesn't really exist. It's all in our heads. And it may be true or may not be true, but I guess I have a difficult with people that make exclusionary statements like that.
And I think I'm going to touch on that a little bit later because I've got another idea that I think on the second half of the show, maybe we'll talk about the cons of her philosophy. But I tend to agree with you. I read a lot of her stuff. The Fountainhead, what is it? We the Living, I believe, was one of her earlier books, and Atlas Shrugged. And I found the philosophy of objectivism very fascinating. I think a lot of young people did. Certainly, a lot of the early Rush albums were influenced by that. Neil Peart, especially the lyric writer for the band. But he grew out of that. I grew out of that. I've known a lot of people that appreciated her writing early on and then later on said, this is not possible. To be a completely rational and reasonable human being without this idea of faith and love based in something else. Even the great Stoics had the belief that there was some sort of deity, that you couldn't get something from nothing, that there had to be something there that was the creator of all these things.
Yeah.
And so I grew out of that phase like a lot of other people, I think, did that were fans of hers early on. I think you're right. You can't, this is a pronouncement that says this is the only place that, or the only way that you could possibly love. And I disagree with that, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later.
Okay. Yeah, and I agree with you with the growing out part to a point, because I think a lot of what she has to say is very important and very relevant to everybody. It just doesn't encompass everything. And I think almost all philosophies are like that. They all have important insights into the human condition, and they all have things that don't quite fit, because no philosophy can fit everything. But I think her biggest thing my takeaway was people have free will, and people decide what they're going to do with their lives, and they need to acknowledge that. And a lot of people don't. I know I constantly am running around. What do I got to do? I got to do this. I've got demands on me. I have no freedom to do what I want to do. And yet, deep down, I know I've chosen every step that I've taken, and I need to acknowledge that. And I think her biggest push was to force people to acknowledge everything you do as a choice that you've made to do. And it puts a lot of responsibility on a person to say, okay, I'm responsible for almost everything in my life. It's tough.
So we were talking the other day about this when we were thinking about this show, and we talked about her background a little bit. And I mentioned that she never had children. Yeah. And we thought, well, there's really, I better not say we. I thought, but I think you agreed that having children changes you.
Yeah.
And it's something that you cannot explain to other people unless they've had children themselves.
Yeah.
And I don't want to step on that landmine that J.D. Vance stepped on recently, talking about the single women with cats. But there's something there when you have kids that opens up your mind to this idea of selflessness and sacrificial love that I think disproves this idea that you have to, or that selfishness is a virtue. I think there's room for this idea of selfishness, and maybe selfishness is not the right word, but self-interest driving you and motivating you to do good things.
Yeah.
But in the end, I think it's the wrong word, and that might be the problem with her philosophy in general, is that we're using the wrong word.
Right.
But conceptually, she doesn't say things that I think are too far off the mark. And for example, one of the ideas of objectivism is that you're not really doing good things out of some sort of selflessness. You're doing it because it makes you feel good. And in that sense, it's a selfish motivation. If you see somebody drowning in a river and you dive in and pull them out, you did it because it felt like it was the right thing to do, and it made you feel good that you were a hero, and therefore it really wasn't a selfless act. It was a selfish act. If you give money to the poor, you do it because it makes you feel good. Again, it's a self-interested act.
Yeah, but I think what's happening there, though, is the word selfishness is being broadened so much to the point where it encompasses everything you do. When I breathe, I'm doing it so I stay alive. When my body monitors its temperature, it's doing it to make sure it stays alive. That's a selfish act. So is my breathing a selfish act? Technically, yes. But I think that's almost broadening it too much, because the word selfish is used in a narrow context. And I think what happens here is, once again, we've talked about definitions before. people have different definitions. And I think the word selfish has a lot of subtle variations. And I think everybody probably has slightly different variations on how they view that word. So I think we do a lot of selfish stuff. Some of it wouldn't necessarily be called selfish, like breathing. But let me mention something. I saw an article in the National Library of Medicine, and I should give the name because my wife says I should always give names of people who write articles. Scott Barry Kaufman and Emmanuel Jock. And the title of this study was Healthy Selfishness and Pathological Altruism, Measuring Two Paradoxical Forms of Selfishness.
Ooh.
And it was a fascinating study, and basically what it comes down to is it talks about healthy selfishness, which I guess you would define as going for your goals, being an achiever, being ambitious, not necessarily the bad side of selfishness, was related to higher levels of psychological well-being and adaptive psychological functioning, as well as a genuine pro-social orientation. Pathological altruism was associated with maladaptive psychological outcomes, vulnerable narcissism, and selfish motivations for helping others. And that sort of brings up the whole virtue signaling thing. And
Wow.
Exactly what you're talking about, where
Right.
people do things for other people, and yet inside, it's the motivations that are different,
Right.
because they're a little bit selfish about it. And maybe selfishness is more an internal thing about your motivations rather than what you actually end up doing. So it's an interesting study, and it showed that there were those correlations.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
I got a quote here that I'd like to share that I think goes along with that. And I actually wanted to start off with this, and I slipped my mind. But this is from Aristotle, and I think this demonstrates that even before Rand was talking about this, people a long time ago were thinking about this very concept. He says, "For if anyone is constantly anxious that he himself more than any other person should do what is just or temperate or anything else connected with virtue, and in short is always for gaining something honorable for himself, no one would call such a man selfish, nor blame him. And yet such a character as this would seem to be particularly selfish, for he gives to himself what is most honorable and the greatest of goods, and gratifies the governing part of himself, and obeys it in everything." And I think that's what you were just talking about, what that study was confirming, is that
the excessive do-gooder kind of
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
So,
Interesting.
have we solved anything yet?
No, we're
No,
not.
all right.
I'm not sure we're going to make it that far, but we can work on it. Another side of selfishness that I think caused a lot of disagreement is Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand of people pursuing their own interests. And he actually wrote an even more important book, I don't remember the name of it, aside from The Wealth of Nations, which we also have, about morality. And he thought that morality by people in society was extremely important. And the invisible hand was actually supposed to be a supplement to the morality of citizens. And a lot of people think of him as saying everybody should be selfish, but he's not really saying that. He's saying everybody should pursue their own interests, and overall that is for the betterment of society. And that's a slightly subtle difference from being always selfish. So I just want to bring that in because I know a lot of times that's misunderstood, and that subtlety is not always acknowledged.
That is a different word. To be self-interested, there is a distinction there versus being selfish.
Right.
Pursuing your interests, does that equate to selfishness, or is there, as you say, subtlety in that?
Yeah, I think to some people they're very similar, and some people are not. And I think that's one of the big divides, I think, between people communicating, is they think of self-interest as always being selfish, but it's not, in my view.
No, and I agree with you. And I think a great example of that is that you love books. You enjoy selling books, and you have a bookstore. I couldn't do what you do. It wouldn't interest me. I love books, but I would not want to do retail.
Yeah.
And so it's not in my interest. I don't know if that makes me or makes you selfish any more than being an insurance broker makes me selfish. And so you pursue your interests, and capitalism works because I like books. I want to buy books. I just don't want to sell them. I want to buy them, and you sell them.
Which is great.
Yeah, that's great. By the way, have you bought any life insurance recently?
No. I don't have a lot of income that needs to be protected. Our income might go up if I disappeared.
Forgive me. I'm just pursuing my interests now.
Yeah.
But I think that's the key difference, is that when we talk about our self-interest. We're not necessarily talking about selfishness. We're pursuing the things that are important to us. And that they're important to us doesn't make us selfish. It just makes us unique.
Yeah.
We're pursuing our own individual interests, and in the pursuit of that, I'm actually helping you out.
And honestly, that might be a better word for objectivism and Rand's philosophy.
I think so.
I don't know if that word was in use much back then. It's been a while, and I
Right.
don't know the history of that word. But maybe the term self-interest may have not been something that was commonly used. And she wanted to use something that was reactionary, of course, because she loved to stir the pot.
Right.
We're going to take a quick break now for some selfish here for the bookstore. And this is Ceasefire with Dale and Ron, and we'll come back in just a minute after we selfishly raise some funds for the show. Boerne has its own bookshop. In fact, it's called the Boerne Bookshop. Hi, I'm Dale Adams, inviting you to get lost. Get lost in a good book in our relaxed and casual atmosphere. We have a wide and eclectic selection in the Boerne Bookshop, and we pride ourselves on finding what you are looking for. We do author meet and greets, host writing workshops, and can connect you with a good book club. And your young ones will absolutely love our kids section at the Boerne Bookshop. And while we want you to get lost, we're easy to find, as we're in the heart of Boerne at the back of the Richter Tavern building. We are the Boerne Bookshop. Welcome back to Ceasefire. This is Dale and Ron, and we've been talking about selfishness, but I actually prefer the term self-interest because selfishness has this nasty sound to it, and some people don't even like self-interest, but we all have it, and we all pursue it, and sometimes governments help us, and sometimes they don't.
That's right. You often talk about people. In fact, in one of our shows recently, you were talking about some of your friends that were having a disagreement and they were talking past each other. And sometimes that happens because we're using the wrong words. We're really not that far off base from each other. There's a lot of common agreement, but the wrong word choice gets us off on a different path.
Yeah. Some people call that a dog whistle. Some people do just react to the word that's being used rather than trying to think about what's actually being said. We all do that. I do that.
I've actually keep notes of all the times that you do that.
Yeah, I'm not known for always saying the right thing. But I get by anyway.
Let's dive further into this idea of how that self-interest can help other people. And I'll start with another quote, and this one from Ralph Waldo Emerson. I love this quote. I've shared this one a lot. It is one of the most beautiful compensations in life that no man can sincerely help another without helping himself.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of ties in a little bit to the Aristotle quote, too.
Yeah.
There's no way you can do something good for somebody without it benefiting you in some way.
Yeah.
You know.
And honestly, that's usually in a sort of an internal, spiritual way or emotional way, which objectivism doesn't really acknowledge, which I think is one of its shortcomings, but that's a side note.
Yeah, no, I agree. We could go off on another trail there.
I need to leave that behind and move on to other stuff, yeah. But yeah, I think that's so true. We do stuff all the time for others, and we get a lot of benefit out of it. We really do.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that when you have kids, it's a seismic shift in your viewpoint on life. Suddenly you are part of the continuity of humanity, and you have a role in that, and you're working on a project that's bigger than you. It's as big as the species. And
Right.
so suddenly you're getting something out of it that changes your life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was trying to explain to you the other day at lunch, and I did a poor job of it. I thought about it more when I went home. That the day that my daughter was born, I told you that when I held her in my arms, I just teared up uncontrollably.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking to myself, where is all this coming from? All this great swell of emotion, and in that moment, I could feel this greater sense of purpose in my life, and that was beyond my own interest. And yet, at the same time, it was in my interest to make sure that she had a great life, and that I did everything that I could to be a good father, to enable her to have a high quality of life.
Yeah.
So again, I think we're talking about the same thing. That I don't think that objectivism was necessarily wrong. It was maybe just some wrong word choices and a lack of faith.
Yeah.
You know?
And it was also narrowly focused, I think, more on governance than it was on just people's interactions and their family lives and stuff like that. It was focused on how governments treat its people,
Right.
which is a different ballgame from raising a family,
Right. And
usually.
yeah, and I think if she had, and maybe this is unfair, I'm stepping on the third rail again, but I think if she had children, it would have been interesting to see
Yeah.
how her philosophy might have changed.
Yeah.
If she had 1, 2, or 3 children.
I think it would have enriched it because I think she would have started seeing how that applies in other parts of people's lives, just their economic and their interactions with their governments and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think government does have a role in that it needs to prevent selfishness from harming others. So if I have an interest in tormenting people, keep that to your free speech side and nowhere else kind of thing. I think government also is supposed to allow people their selfishness to drive them to their happiness. So our governments make roads, they keep the peace so that we can go out and pursue our interests. And so government is enabling our selfishness. I should stop using that word because it really is self-interest. I prefer that much more. And that's one of the roles of government, is to allow us to pursue our self-interests. And then a third thing is governments guide our selfishness, offer incentives for us to do different things that we may not normally do. They give tax breaks for this or that activity, or they punish people for whatever activities they don't want people to do. And so governments utilize this selfishness or self-interest of people for its own purposes and have a role in allowing people to pursue their self-interests.
That's interesting. So then take that one step further. It's not in government's interest then to tamp down that self-interest. And maybe, again, we go back to that word choice. We stop using selfishness and talk about self-interest and stop making self-interest a 4-letter word.
Yeah.
And then ask our government to stop de-incentivizing us from pursuing that.
We can ask that, but that comes to the crux of different types of government. A capitalist system, marketplace system, is based on people pursuing their self-interest. A communist government is based on suppressing that and only pursuing the goals that the collective desires, whatever that is. And so that what form of government determines how the government interacts with people's self-interest and selfishness.
Heady stuff. Self-interest, it's interesting. If for those that think it's a negative thing, self-interest is, I'm going to be political here for a second, but if you're a nature lover and you want to conserve land, that's self-interest. If you are a banker or a real estate agent and you want to move property or make loans, that's self-interest.
Yeah.
It works on both sides of the political spectrum, and they're both motivated by their interests and their pursuit of whatever government policy or lack of government policy that they prefer.
Yes.
It's self-interest across the board.
Everything everybody does is self-interest. I do think sometimes that's made more vague by people's value systems when they decide that their self-interests are part of the value system. They have a self-interest in that area because that's what they want and they believe, but they tie their value system to it so that it's harder for them to have a conversation about it, and other people end up not being allowed to talk about it because that's not acceptable. Value systems tend to be absolute, and once we tie things to our value systems, we can't. It's very hard for us to let go of them. And I think that's one of the problems we have nowadays with our interests, is that we tie them to our value system externally. Not internally they are, but we need to recognize that externally in our interactions with society, it's an interest. It's not a value.
Yeah. So that takes me back to what we were talking about earlier, and I had that quote and from Rand where she talked about love as a value. And I think about that, and her argument is that it's selfish, but I think about that, and it's what compels you. If you're a mom, you're standing, or a father, I'll just use a father, you're standing there in front of your house, your child's out in the street playing, and a car comes racing by. And you have just moments to run out there and push your child out of the way into safety, but not enough time to then pull yourself out of the way, right? That cannot be a selfish act. Again, going back to the argument about if you pull somebody out of a raging river and you save them from drowning because it makes you feel good and it makes you feel like a hero, therefore that's a selfish act. Okay, so let's use this other scenario. You're going to sacrifice your life. Now we're talking about sacrificial love, this concept that we were touching on when we were talking about having children.
Yeah.
Is that a selfish act? How can you argue that? You're going to give up something. You're obviously placing a greater value on another human being, greater than your own. That cannot be selfishness, and that's why I don't think that word works.
Okay, this has been a fascinating discussion.
I know.
And,
I think we need another half hour.
Yeah.
Boot the next show. We're going to selfishly take the next half hour.
Oh, we can't do that. We haven't paid for the next half hour.
Oh, that's not in our best interest then.
Yeah. This is Ceasefire with Dale and Ron. Thank you for listening. If you missed any of this, you can catch it on our podcast. It's at the BoerneRadio.com website.
And if you've got any interest in learning more about objectivism, stop by the Boerne Bookshop and ask Dale for some book suggestions.
Yeah, we got several Ayn Rand books, and we got a philosophy section also that has a variety of philosophers, some that I've never even heard of that I've picked up. Till next week.
All right, see you then.
Boerne has its own bookshop. In fact, it's called the Boerne Bookshop. Hi, I'm Dale Adams, inviting you to get lost. Get lost in a good book in our relaxed and casual atmosphere. We have a wide and eclectic selection in the Boerne Bookshop, and we pride ourselves on finding what you are looking for. We do author meet and greets, host writing workshops, and can connect you with a good book club. And your young ones will absolutely love our kids section at the Boerne Bookshop. And while we want you to get lost, we're easy to find, as we're in the heart of Boerne at the back of the Richter Tavern building. We are the Boerne Bookshop.
Boerne Radio 103.9 FM. Now let's head over to the Patrick Heath Public Library with Miss Constance for Children's Story Time. As the Patrick Heath Library is open today from 10 to 4, this is Boerne Radio.